solutions. You're rebuilding nature, biodiversity. It means increase the regenerational capacity of nature to support ecosystem services for people and in the future also. You often if you rebuild nature, you would also have more things to harvest at present from the nature, and it's not only about adaptation. It could also and sustainable. You could both have mitigation and adaptation relating to nature-based solutions. So, nature-based solution as definition is that people work with nature, mimic their structure, regenerate nature through protection, restoration, management, or creation of novel ecosystems, by protecting biodiversity also, to solve societal challenges. So that's really the what nature-based solution means. It's supposed to solve a societal challenge of some sort. And this societal challenge could be mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, flood erosion control, coastal defense, cooling and shading for people in warm areas, food and water security, livelihoods, and you could get other kinds of livelihoods with restoring nature, for instance, cultural values, and social capital. You could build social capital around people being out in nature, enjoying nature together. That's what they mean with social capital, or other ways of building social capital through nature. And the outcome, they think, if you build all this nature-based solution into climate-based into climate-resilient pathways, you would serve many of the sustainable development goals. So therefore, nature-based solution could solve many other problems than just climate, and therefore they have become very popular. It's especially Europe pushing this concept, but it has been mainstream now to use in most of the climate policies, especially. Yeah? And it's, as you know, it's also a part of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Nature-based solution is very clearly in several of the paragraphs there. So, as a nature-based solution, it has to provide one or more benefits to people, but while causing no loss to biodiversity or ecological integrity. So that's more like an insurance for being able to regenerate nature. And it should preferably be co-produced, and that has to do with this climate justice kind of thinking. So let's start with creation of novel habitats, because maybe we haven't been thinking too much about that. How we could build things that to a larger extent mimic nature's own way of functioning. For instance, the creation of artificial reefs of things that has been wrecked, or things, or even build these reefs to actually increase nursery habitat, biodiversity, and create clean waters. We could actually build these underwater reefs. As a climate adaptation action, for instance, reducing risk of sea level rise and storm surges, but it's also important for tourism. We could build a tourism livelihood on that and increase biodiversity. This is what they do in the Agora project in Portugal. They are building artificial reefs and let people dive on it also. Or you could do as they've done in Tasmania. We build giant kelp forest gardens, underwater gardens, to capture carbon, protect coastline, and for creating a richer ocean. We are doing this in a very small scale together with the school in Hansnes. We are trying to build an underwater garden with them. So that is something you could start doing here, think about here also, to build a more productive ecosystem. And then you also have this example. This is from Singapore. They are very innovative in what they are doing. Here they have built vertical flats where you would have farming. Yeah, but they have flats with farming also. This is not flats, this is just farming. But it's vertical farming of vegetables in Singapore, where you are building crops in a three-dimensional structure rather than just on the ground. So you take much less space doing this at the same time as you are creating shades and better air in Singapore city. But they have also built vertical blocks where people live and they could grow their own gardens. And that's also something that is possible to think about for those big cities, at least, that you are actually greening the cities, and that could solve quite a bit of problems in the cities while capturing carbon and purifying the air. Yeah. And then, of course, I have to mention our own project on restoration of kelp. It's actually so that you could, of course, have a rainforest fund, and Norway invests quite a lot in protecting rainforests for building as a nature-based solution to capture carbon. But kelp is 20 times more effective than rainforest to store carbon, and it's regenerates after 6 months, so it takes a very short time. And more than 50% of the kelp in Norway has been grazed by urchins, so there's a great potential for this nature-based solution. And it also has a range of co-benefits for nature and people. So you would have higher biodiversity, seabird halt seabird decline. You're spending enormous amount of funding on monitoring seabirds, but if we get a richer ocean, we could halt declines. There is the fisheries there don't want to have to go so far out with their boats to fish. If we restore the fjords outside their doorstep, they could have smaller boats and they could more easily land things locally. So you could have fishery industry on land. You will have more other resources. You could, if you have enough kelp, you could have kelp harvesting, and you could have other kinds of resources. You could also think about urchins as a resource, as we are doing in this project. It's about, and now we have the new nature restoration law in EU, and there are not only kelp, of course, but it's very effective and something that is not very controversial, which everyone could support. The only thing that is act as a barrier here is finances to do that. That's the only thing. There's not a lot of disagreement of restoring urchins, removing urchins and restoring kelp. And there are several such things we could do that will benefit, have high public benefits. The problem is that you don't find one actor who's willing to invest in it because it doesn't come directly back to them. But if we thought that the society invests, that we will get a lot of resources back for future generation and for people living in this area. So starting to think more in terms of restoration of nature, where nature has been lost, could actually be economically beneficial for the planet, but perhaps not for a single business. And this is the way we have to start to change things, the way we think about climate change. So that's the restoration. I said something about creation, restoration, and then you have management. And management, you remember in the Kunming-Montreal agreement, you have this, all lands should be planned, yeah? you should have spatial planning for all pieces on land, ecosystem based, to protect biodiversity, and that should be a part of all what you're doing. But you could also, but it's also very emphasized that you should think in terms of nature-based solution. Like when you are doing this spatial planning, you should think about all the different things you could do in the landscape to solve for mitigation and adaptation, and also biodiversity protection. For instance, when you think about ecosystem-based management, you could take a catchment to coast approach, where you would think that, okay, if it's less snow and or more precipitation in mountains, it could be beneficial to have a forest there. You also have to manage the wetlands in a way that help them filtrate water. You can should plant some or manage the pastures so that those plant species with deeper roots are there, so that you could hold on to some water. You should also make sure that you have plant things so that you mitigate flooding and retain water when it's drought. So that's also something. You could protect the wetlands here. That's store carbon, and it help birds nesting grounds, and it also actually filtrates water, so that with flooding it's dampening the consequences of that on the city that is here. You should also have some vegetation on the coastline here, because otherwise the sea level rise and the storm surges will flood into this field, and not least into the cities. And that would be much cheaper to build than to build infrastructures of different sorts. So if you just have vegetation, it will be much cheaper. And in addition to that, vegetation is important for filtrating water, so that you could have clean water running into the city. So you have to think on a landscape level, and that's what the first point in the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Think spatial planning on a large scale, and bring in natural solutions into climate resilient pathways for the whole landscape. In that way, you fulfill both the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. And here is just EUCN's way of thinking about it. That is, if you are managing this forest well, it helps mitigate climate change. And climate change put pressure on ecosystems, which has impacts on the ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services, the lack of ecosystem services flowing to people makes them more vulnerable to these changes if you are not mitigating. But if you are mitigating, you are less vulnerable. But at the same time, people have the adaptive capacity to respond and actually manage the forest in a proper way to support ecosystem services, and to mitigate climate change and to adapt. So yeah, so that's what ecosystem-based adaptation is about. In a short term, it could boost the delivery of ecosystem goods such as fish, crops, things like that, and make them more resilient towards diseases and pathogens. And then it's also it's an insurance towards climate change, invasive species, and new pathogens. Because if you have a higher ecosystem connectivity and biodiversity at multiple trophical level, nature has several climate resilient pathways where the change could be mitigated by nature itself. So it's an insurance policy to manage, restore, and protect nature to be able to adapt to climate change. I know I talked a lot about the blue and green infrastructure already. So but that's about planning in a city. Then you should also plan the blue and green infrastructure in the whole city, taking all these things into account. But I think I said something in that direction already. Yes. And now, the last point, protection, protected areas. On the one hand, you could take like the rainforest in the world and the wetlands in the world and protect a lot of the world's biodiversity. Except that a lot of the world's biodiversity is in the ocean. But you could take on land, you could protect these areas and say, we're done. Now we have done it, we finished. We have protected so much that we have carbon storage and we have all these things. For instance, if you protect all the wetlands, you will protect 40% of all species that breed and live in the world. 40% of all species are you find in wetlands. You will have enormous potential for carbon storage, and you will protect against flooding, and you will purify and provide clean drinking water for millions of people. So that's protecting wetlands could have an enormous effect globally. But is protected areas always the solution? What are you thinking about protected areas? It's very often so that people say it's just to protect everything and then you will be fine. Yeah. Do you think this is the solution? Yeah?
Well, we're talking about a lot of indigenous use and cultural value also connected to areas. So to protect and to limit all human activity is also a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
In many areas.
If you think about that, how we have displaced indigenous people around the world when we protected areas. Yellowstone people were transported out of Yellowstone when they established that first national park in the world. And there are a lot of injustices around the world protecting people. So it doesn't really meet one of the requirements for climate resilient pathways. If you are not constructing it together with people and let people be stewards of it, to protect these areas together with you. So a lot of people feel it's unjust, and especially in a vulnerable area who needs these areas for subsistence uses. You have quite big, you say, recognitional injustices by distributional injustices as well, by displacing people from protected areas. Therefore, there is not always so big support for protected areas because people have done it in the wrong way previously in the past, with this fortress conservation where you keep bush hunting out of protected areas, for instance, and by making fortress conservation, you also don't let animals migrate as they should. So there have been many failures for this typical fortress conservation philosophy. So protection is one thing, but it's very important that you think about how you are crafting this together with people and maybe let people be a part of its management. For instance, in Norway, local boards, local politicians are managing the national parks. And it's maybe not always a success, but it gains a lot of trust and legitimacy. That's what we found through the study we had. So, and it works well in Karlsøy. They are very interested in being steward for this area, for instance. So if you let local people be a part of the management, it's more easy to get a legitimate protected area than if you just have a top-down philosophy about it. Yeah? So maybe it's not always providing outcomes immediately, but when people have the feeling that they are involved, they start to think that they are responsible for this area, and therefore they want to protect it. And you have some very good example, which you should look into, lion guards. I don't know if anyone of you have seen what the lion guards has done in protected areas in the African countries, where they train people who do bush hunting into lion guards instead. So they would be guardians of lions, and they would have small-scale community tourism, and they would still be allowed to hunt some species, but other species they would protect by themselves because they have become their guards. So and to work like that, this takes time. It takes time, and it takes design. So to design it. So while there are many examples that restoration is something that could benefit many, it's too costly. Protection is in a way something that you could do, but at the same time it could come with costs and social costs. Yeah. So restoration, economic costs, protection, social costs. So therefore, this Seddon, who has become like one of the strongest voices in the academic literature on nature-based solution, says that it has to be a place-based approach on these nature-based solutions. People who live or are attached to a place should be engaged in the design, implementation, management, monitoring, and evaluation of a nature-based solution. Then you create climate resilient and just pathways. Intervention should foster ownership, empowerment, and well-being for the local stewards managing the ecosystem. So we also need to plan how this could benefit the local, for instance, by creating new types of livelihoods. So why co-create or co-produce nature-based solution? Well, one is the moral and ethical reasons. Cannot undermine people's livelihood, economy, and culture by establishing nature-based solutions in the backyard. So that's one thing. And then you have stewards. Indigenous and local communities have rich knowledge of local ecosystems that we experience. We've been out both now in Varanger and in Målselv and in the Vesterålen area and in Karlsøy. And people have so much knowledge about the fjords. It's incredible how much they know and which we don't know, especially along the coast, because we don't have really any scientific studies about the coast, not many scientific studies about the coast. So we actually have to rely on local knowledge to understand the system. And this is also the case in many parts of the world where you don't have expensive scientific monitoring programs, that you actually have to rely on people's knowledge to understand the systems and how you could actually create nature-based solutions. So the point is that you think that there has been a lot of adaptive learning on what can work and lessons from past mistakes. Yeah. And then you have adaptation. So you have to bring in a set of learning, and we are doing that through living labs in Agora, so that you always are evaluating the nature-based solution you're trying to implement. Are they working? Are they not working? Are there any distributional injustices here by implementing these kind of solutions? So adaptive management, so that you continuously learn and adjust according to failures and successes, is important. And then you have this distributional equity. So it's less likely that we do this in a way that harm local communities if they are involved, then we have the knowledge for designing this effectively. If you're thinking about an ecosystem-based adaptation plan for the whole a big area, catchment coast area, should collaborate with people to do that. And then it should also be adjusted to local norm, values, belief. And that will also encourage likelihood of success. Yes, and then there are some limitations of nature-based solutions. And there are many who are afraid that nature-based solution will be a replacement for mitigation policies for decarbonization. So that's important to say that it's not a replacement, it's just a low-cost strategy for building climate resilience, but it cannot replace the need to stop fossil greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, so that's important. It could create perverse incentives because these carbon markets that are built now, where you actually invest in carbon offset for people who are restoring, for instance, different places. For instance, this could cost in solutions that are good for carbon, maybe. So you cannot just have one thing you're focusing on, like carbon, but it could have impacts on biodiversity, food and water security. For instance, this what has been very debated is this afforestation, to plant trees, often non-native trees, just for the reason of binding carbon. And that has a lot of consequences, and it also often turns out to be maybe invasive species, more fire-prone species. You have the eucalyptus, who has caused quite a big trouble in certain places in the world. So when you plant that, so things like that is not really nature-based solutions. So that's important to keep in mind. It's a limitation there. You cannot just pick out mitigation and think that you don't have to take care of the other things, because you are supposed to take care of biodiversity and ecological integrity to call it a nature-based solution. Yeah. It could also lead to green grabbing. So if we start to put value, a carbon market on forest, they will increase their value. And this means that it could easily be commodified. That means that someone would like to own that forest and earn money on carbon credit. And that could displace and marginalize poor and vulnerable communities from areas that they have used for hunting and fishing and small scale maybe crops for a very long time, and which is being commodified because the value are so high for rich people to offset their emissions. So that's also a concern here we need to think about. So we need training and capacity building for promoting a nature-based solution. Yeah, that's the limitation. Yeah, and yeah. So so if you take training and capacity building for promoting nature-based solution, it might be that you disregard inclusiveness and empowerment and real collaboration. So that's another thing we need to be aware of. And again, this strong focus on climate policies, especially mitigation, climate mitigation, could have biodiversity impacts, and that's something we've seen in many cases. And for instance, you have biofuel which is not really very beneficial for rainforest in the world. So biofuel for mitigating emissions through new kinds of fuels is also a problem here. And so we need to have a more like, integrated, holistic way of seeing things to plan for nature-based solution to be a part of climate resilience pathways. Yeah. So in the end here, it's really just repeating what I said a bit. Guidelines. It's not a substitute for decarbonization. It's a protection and restoration of a wide range of naturally occurring ecosystems and on land and in the sea. So you have to have a more landscape view on it, broad scale view on it. It has to be implemented with full engagement and consent of indigenous people and local communities, and women and disadvantaged groups should be included. So it's the ethical part, you know, the disadvantaged groups, the vulnerable groups, and so when biodiversity should be a part of all kinds of nature-based solutions. So we shouldn't, in a way, ignore that when crafting climate policies. Yes, and this is what I had today. So I don't know if you have any more questions about either climate resilient pathways or nature-based solutions. Yeah.
I've read something about OECMs, like other effective area-based management. Is that part of like a nature-based solution? Or
I don't know what it is.
Okay, because it's been talked about as like a alternative to protective areas, where instead of having a protected area that is totally exclusive of human activity, you have like what they call OECM, other effective area-based protection.
I understand. This is probably the, but they are in the EUCN as protected areas.
Yeah.
Both sustainable use areas and indigenous tenures, you could see. Areas which indigenous people have managed for many years could be protected under the International Union of Conservation of Nature. So you could, they could be protected, but at the same time, 1/4 of the land in the world is used and managed by indigenous people. So some of it is owned, like in tenures, and some of them are just used. So this, I think I've heard that word before. I just don't know the depth of that word, but I think this is also what it refers to. That you actually, these sustainable use practices that have been there for a long time could be other effective area protection. But of course also you could have biosphere reserves where you have a core which is more protected, and then a buffer zone where you have sustainable use, and then integrate the people and nature to a large extent, and then a transition area. So you have a lot of this area-based management, protection forms already out there, and they are also incorporated in IUCN as a. You could, but you're dependent on the government sending it in as a designated place. So many of these areas are managed without designation. And actually, when you look at areas where there are a lot of indigenous people, they found no differences between protected, strict protection, and indigenous inhabited areas. And in certain places, it's actually more biodiversity there when controlled for other factors.
Yeah.
So that's why they have probably started to talk about other effective management areas.
Yeah. So I think the plan, or like the idea was that you build a protected area. They're supposed to have the same protection level as an actual strictly protected area, but you build the management and yeah, the management is built upon like structures that is already there. For example,
Yeah.
indigenous groups and use. Yeah.
Things that has been sustainably used over a very long time. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Did you learn anything new today, or was this familiar to you all? Yeah, that's good. So, yeah, do you have any other questions to this? Yeah, since I'm finished before time. No.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. Yeah, but then I can. I guess we are just. What will happen now for this module is that there is one lecture, and that's coming up next. Is this scenario and like how can you? Because if you are going to construct these climate resilient pathways, we need scenarios. And they could be predictive, exploratory, or desirable scenarios in the future, or visions. Yeah, and I will on Wednesday I will go through these different forms. I think not the predictive one so much because Andrea covered it quite a lot, and then how they could be a part of our thinking in terms of both climate resilient pathways, but also pathways for transformative